Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Crypto News podcast. I am especially pumped for this one today, folks. This is something that I've been a bit of a rabbit hole I've been going down over the last couple of months. I don't really know how to express my feelings about this because it's twofold. On one side of the coin, some incredible technologies and some hopefully life-changing things are going to come via this crazy thing that we will soon have, which is called quantum computing. Well, we have it, but I mean really good. And on the other side, it scares the living shit out of me because there are billion-dollar institutions, countries, wealth funds, whatever the case may be, anything of importance that could very well be hacked from these magical quantum computers that we will get. And we'll get into that. I first met this lad a year ago in Dubai. It was right after the great flood of Dubai and consensus. A year later, we got him on the pod. Today, we have John Lilic on the show, CEO of Telos, a tech entrepreneur and investor focused on blockchain, cryptography, and quantum infrastructure. He is a leading angel VC. He's been in the space for a hot minute and recently has taken the Q pill and believes that the quantum threat and the opportunity are arriving much sooner and more profoundly than most in the blockchain ecosystem realize. This is going to be a banger of an episode. John, welcome to the show, my friend. Pumped to have you on. How you doing today?
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm doing very well, and it's great to see you. And yeah, exactly. It was actually Token 2049 when we last met during that great flood, which was incredible. And so many of my colleagues and friends, I mean, they had like an arduous journey to get from the airport to their hotel. But yeah, a lot has happened since then. I mean, last time we kind of talked about all the ZK stuff, and that was one of the things we were focused on at Telos. And I would generally speaking, I would say that the entire ZK ecosystem has advanced tremendously since then. And I have a lot of respect for all the researchers and all the various teams. It's very, very hard. And, you know, sometimes the gains seem kind of incremental, but actually they're monumental when you consider the scope and scale of the challenge. And so, you know, I've been kind of heads down focused on that for quite some time. But then last summer, as you said, I got Q-pilled. And pretty much the way I describe it is I started hanging out with people who began kind of opening my mind and helping me understand actually that the quantum computing ecosystem is tremendously advanced, very far along. It has been around for a long, long time with all the smartest institutional capital, as you mentioned, sovereign wealth funds, etc., having long ago made investments in companies like Global Foundries or PsiQuantum, etc. And in particular, I started hanging out with a couple guys from Oxford, Stefano and Fabrizio. They're physicists. They're also, interestingly, software engineers and cryptographers who understand the blockchain and our ecosystem. And so they're really at this rare intersection of like all those things like physics, computer science, and let's say finance. And so we kind of started talking. And then I started doing my own research. And what I realized was basically, quantum had always been something that was in the back of my mind as like a very far off, distant technology that would, you know, allow us to revolutionize chemistry, biology, material science, allow us to simulate nuclear fusion and build extremely complex technologies and so on. And I figured, well, that's already going to be like, you know, some future state where we live in Star Trek at that point. I'm not sure that caring about Bitcoin is going to be such a big deal because, you know, we'll be in a different type of civilization and so on. And it's like very far away, right? It's another 20, 30, 40 years. But then I came to realize that actually when you look at what's happening in this ecosystem, rather than gigantic machines that only the government, the NSA or Google or something can build, in fact, the startup ecosystem is extremely dynamic and it has a multitude of approaches. And those approaches have these characteristics that these terms will become much more well known in the future, I believe. So like photonic wafer platforms, trapped ions, etc., like different ways of approaching the problem. PsiQuantum, as an example, is building much smaller devices based on their photonic wafer platform. And so if you imagine one device, instead of it having to stabilize, you know, 1 million plus qubits, which is like very, very hard, what if it only had to really worry about, let's say, 1,152 qubits? And what if you could network 6,000 of these devices together? Well, in that scenario, you have a very useful quantum computer that can break elliptic curve cryptography. And so that's what I started to realize. Actually, there's a multitude of approaches. The other side of it is you need algorithms. You need algorithmic improvements because qubits make a lot of noise, okay? And you have to kind of filter through that noise. And so when you look at something like Google Willow, and I think a lot of crypto got that wrong And, a lot of Bitcoin maximalists just call these kinds of things a scam, which I think is a disservice to Bitcoin. But in reality, Google Willow shows that we can have error correction at scale. So it's like a fundamental piece of the puzzle. And so the potential to then kind of like realize what I just described is becoming more and more real. Now, the other side of it is when you think about all these other future incredible possibilities, like simulating nuclear fusion and so on, those are definitely really exciting things to think about. But the reality is, before that happens, elliptic curve cryptography, which is the basis of everything, will have been broken a long time before that. It's the first thing to go. Okay. And so then you kind of start thinking about the incentives around all this stuff. And, I've written some articles on my Twitter, on my LinkedIn. And really, when you look at it from an incentive standpoint, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Andreas Antonopoulos. I met him a few times, early days at the Bitcoin Center in New York City. He's Greek. I love Greeks, my favorite people in the world. And he's a very elegant speaker. Probably his video on quantum computing, which is on YouTube, is like the most watched video on this topic as far as Bitcoin goes. And while he's a very elegant orator and articulates very well, he kind of basically says that there's a really big incentive for Bitcoin and it'll like figure it out, right? So like incentives will sort of solve the problem for us. But the reality is the incentives to achieve and realize quantum computing are vastly bigger than Bitcoin, the entire crypto ecosystem, and much more powerful. In other words, if you can sort of like be one of the first to actually make a useful quantum computer, you're going to be able to impact the economy on a scale that's much, much, much bigger. And so the incentives are actually in some ways working against Bitcoin, because the incentives to achieve a quantum computer that can break elliptic curve cryptography are much bigger. And so, that kind of like struck a chord with me, and I started unfurling, peeling the layers. And as you sort of like go deeper and deeper, you start to realize there's a whole lot of complexity, which, we can get more into. But when you look at a bank, for example, or any centralized financial institution, all they have to do is just upgrade their ISL, SSL certificates. Basically, it's like adopt the NIST standards and implement, and off you go. With decentralized networks, you have to coordinate, and you basically need 100% of users to participate, because even naive users can potentially cause a cascading wave of like second and third order effects and so on. And so, the scope and scale of the challenge is significant, and it presents lots and lots of weird situations where even the social contract of Bitcoin could be broken, which is something that Jameson Lopp recently talked about. Another guy I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And suddenly he's about as like straight Bitcoin, like OG Puritan as it gets, right? I have a lot of respect for him. He doesn't deviate. He's got his head on straight. And even him, he gets a lot of hate from Bitcoin maximalists who are now calling him a grifter and stuff, which I think is crazy because he articulates the problem very well. For example, potentially 30% of the supply or more of like early Bitcoin that's still out there, the public key is exposed. So I'm not saying he's proposing it. I'm saying that he's saying one way to deal with it is to confiscate that Bitcoin so that it can't be, stolen and, dumped on the market or whatever. But then that creates like the Dow moment for the Bitcoin, where you have a broken social contract. And how do you even know which coins to take, which ones aren't, in someone's possession who isn't like actively monitoring the situation or whatever? And likewise, how would you know when a quantum attack is even happening? Because when it does happen, all you're going to see, and I'm not saying it's happening now, I'm just saying that recently we've seen a lot of threads on X, on Twitter, about old Bitcoin moving, to an exchange. And, the comments are like, oh, this guy's a giga chad. He held for 15 years or she held for 15 years and just made $100 million. Amazing. Well, that's what it would look like. You wouldn't have some big flashing red light or something or siren. And so, those are just some of the challenges, and we can get into more, but you start to unfurl all the different layers, and the complexity is, this is a big challenge. This is a big challenge.
Yeah, well said there. I mean, couple different things to unpack, and that was a great little riff to start the show. John spoke about qubits, quantum bits, the difference between regular bits that we have in our computers and quantum bits. And again, I'm a rookie here, so you can correct me. But how I like to explain it is regular bits, it's sort of binary. You can do zeros, you can do ones. With qubits, you can literally map the whole sort of maze and mathematical problem at the same time. So it just problem solves with a magnitude of, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million X more efficient. Then with current ECC standards, that's where things get spooky. So when John speaks about like the long-term risk and I guess the immediate risk, that is what he's referring to. Another quick thing is the Bitcoin. I feel like, at least with quantum, John, I feel like if someone, whether it's Lazarus Group in North Korea or any of these hacker groups, get their hands on a very powerful quantum computer, I do feel like they're going to go for the bad before the good, just because it's lower hanging fruit. And like building something long-term to get hundreds of billions of dollars, which would probably be the case if they wiped out 30% of Bitcoin, Satoshi's old wallets, would probably be more efficient, right, than creating something long-term, finding the cure for cancer, finding a new type of nuclear fusion, whatever the case may be. So those are just a couple points I wanted to bring up about the immediate risk. Let's talk about the Q-Pill and the actual timeline here, because this is what everyone wants to know. We're recording mid-April. This is going to air mid-April. How far away are we from like shit actually hitting the fan here?
Well, that's a great question. So just one quick point with respect to who could potentially attack the network first. I don't think it's going to be a rogue, nation state like North Korea or anything like that. I actually think there's perfectly legal ways for this to happen. You look at these companies, like I keep talking about PsiQuantum because I'm very bullish about them, but they could, for example, perfectly legally enter into agreements like that guy who threw out his hard drive in the trash in the UK with 8,000 Bitcoin on it. He could approach a company like that, sign an agreement, hey, recover my Bitcoin and I'll give you half or 60% or whatever.
Interesting.
So if you're a company like that,
Wow,
potentially recovering hundreds of millions or billions of dollars between all the lost Bitcoin, and not just Bitcoin, there's like Genesis ETH from the ICO that have been lost. Okay. You're talking about an addressable market that could potentially be tens of billions, or if Bitcoin, does go to the moon and, hits $1 million, it could be hundreds of billions. And so that could be a perfectly legal framework, and you wouldn't know about it. And those parties would be incentivized to not disclose it. Okay. So that's kind of the first thing. The other thing I would say is, and I've said this before publicly, like a guy like Saylor, don't get me wrong, I respect him tremendously. But he's leading an effort, which is now going global, to basically leverage Bitcoin onto the balance sheet of corporates in the United States and now in Japan and many other countries. And so if you're an adversary, and, China is like tremendously capable. We've all seen what they've done with DeepSeek and so on, right? Like how quickly they can move.
yeah.
And so if
Good point.
you imagine a scenario where Bitcoin-based U.S. balance sheets, with BlackRock and everybody else are, a multi-trillion-dollar kind of bounty. Look at this. We've got a trade war happening right now. I mean, you would definitely be interested in creating that kind of economic damage to your adversary by undermining the trust in the entire blockchain ecosystem by breaking Bitcoin, or rather taking some very, very, like, let's say, notable coins like Satoshi's coins or something that everyone would talk about instantly and so on, right? So those are the kinds of scenarios that I think are more likely before the Lazarus or whoever rogue nation state gets their hands on this stuff. It's going to be a long time before they have that kind of capability. Just like with nuclear arms, it's not until much later. The superpowers have it first. And yeah, so with respect to the Q-Pill and when this stuff, may materialize, like I feel as though I've put myself in a situation where I'm either going to look like a genius or a complete idiot, given my, given what I've said publicly. But I've been running my venture fund for a number of years now. I've stopped doing deals where I receive tokens anytime after like the middle of 2027 or 2028. In other words, I believe that and look, you can draw your own conclusions. If you look at, and I'll go back to PsiQuantum again, they are building very large facilities right now. They've got facilities in Brisbane for a long time. They've had a research facility in Palo Alto. They're building an enormous manufacturing facility in Michigan right now. I'm sorry, in the state of Illinois. Governor Pritzker of Illinois, Mayor Brandon Adams of Chicago. These guys are like shilling this company on the front of their X like crazy. You've got Global Foundries, which is moving tremendously fast. You've got Microsoft claiming they have logical qubits, although I guess that's a little bit in dispute. But what I'm trying to say is that I believe we've actually entered into a mass production phase, okay? And I also think, much like with the Manhattan Project, the first run of, let's say, useful quantum computers will like almost certainly go to the NSA or the CIA or the government, as it should. I mean, I'm not saying it shouldn't. I'm just saying it almost certainly will. before the commercial kind of opportunities available to the general public and the economy and the business community at large. And so it's very hard to say really, but I think when you look at some of these breakthroughs, in my mind, and this is the other side of it, I was saying with algorithmic improvements, the algorithmic improvements are being driven by AI to a very large extent. There's a real AI use case. And so when you look at the original DARPA timelines, you look at Riverlane, you look at IBM, you look at, Google, et cetera, all these companies, we are either on schedule or ahead of schedule, actually. And these are timelines that you can go back many years, roadmaps that you can go back many years, and including updated ones and so on, and kind of draw your own conclusions. But I believe that we're on schedule and actually ahead of schedule. And I think that, and by the way, Q day, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily have to be the day at which a 256-bit elliptic curve is broken. Okay. It could be a much smaller demonstration. It could be something like a 32-bit elliptic curve as a demo. And again, these companies have very strong incentives to demonstrate their capability. And so imagine
100%.
something like that was surfaced, okay? And let's say that was surfaced, I don't know, 3 years from now. And, the market is sitting there looking at this capability, and at the same time, it's looking at all of this tremendous, value on chain. And then it's going to analyze how ready are these blockchains for basically mitigating this risk. And even if they do make their best effort and execute in an optimistic way, what is the risk, right? And so, and then the market's going to realize that, wow, this is actually pretty risky. My money is going to be much safer in a bank account, with a bank like JP Morgan, who is already updated to NIST post-quantum, standards and so on. And I think, and then you kind of look at it and you say, well, for blockchains to actually update, migrate, and mitigate is going to take years. And these guys just demonstrated, that they're well on their way, to reaching a state where they can actually break elliptic curve cryptography. The timeline is incongruent at this point, and that's when I think we might see a stampede for the exits. And I've written about this. I think the first exit is going to happen with stable coins in particular, because at this point, stable coins have become institutional in addition to RWAs, particularly on Ethereum, but also now growing on Solana tremendously. You have these institutions who are minting and issuing huge quantities of money. And, these are smart institutions. They're going to look at this and they're going to say, well, for an additional 0.5% or 1% or even 2% yield, I'm assuming this unknown black swan risk when I can just have my money in treasuries or some other money instrument in a bank that's already adopted NIST, post-quantum cryptography standards. I'm not taking that risk. And so that's when I think we're going to see the redemption system of Tether and Circle and others really tested tremendously.
Get a little spooky.
Because,
yeah.
At that point, I don't know anyone at an institutional level who would accept that risk or even can based on their fiduciary responsibilities.
Yeah. Well said there. John, you're on a roll here. When we get back, quick shout out to our sponsor of the show. When we get back, we're going to talk about the post-quantum money vision, some more institutional blind spots, and we're going to take a deep dive for, of course, the listeners, the crypto folks who want to know how they can hedge their exposure to quantum in the crypto space right now. Huge shout out to Treehouse Protocol, new sponsors of the show. I've been following Treehouse for a while, and it's clear they are laying the foundation for fixed income and DeFi. They feature two powerful innovations: T-Assets, which is a new class of liquid staking primitives designed to generate enhanced yields through interest rate arbitrage, and DOR, which is short for Decentralized Offered Rates, a transparent and reliable consensus-driven benchmark rate for digital assets. They're tackling some of DeFi's biggest problems, which are fragmented interest rates and the lack of unified benchmarks. If you want some stable yields or you want to help shape the future of on-chain finance, Treehouse is your play. They're also running their Go Nuts rewards program. Simply hold T-Assets to earn nuts and stand to be rewarded at the end of the program. Head on over to treehouse.finance or follow them on X, TreeHouseFi. Huge shout out to Treehouse. And now back to the show with John. Let's talk about current solutions. A couple weeks ago, I had Ian Smith on the show. Great chat with him. He is running Quantum EVM. He spoke very highly about the Cellframe team. There's a couple other quantum cryptos. I mean, all in, there's about 35 of them. Most of them are Fugazi, just candidly speaking. My team sort of went through the list. Ian also, went through the list as well. And most of them are Fugazi. There's really only a couple. If you are John on April 15th while we are recording, and someone's like, John, gun to your head, you got to choose a couple chains right now that you think could be a bit of a hedge for Q-Day and for PQC. Which ones are you going at, or are you going at none at all?
Well, today, none at all. None at all. I don't think we're at any risk today, and I don't think the risk is material for at least a few more years. Now, if you're asking me April 15th,
Gotcha.
2028, I'll be a bit more nervous.
Different convo.
But today, yeah, definitely not right now. That being said, and while there are initiatives, I guess Selfrun has been around for many years and so on, I think ultimately it really comes down to the large chains and the extent to which they organize. And so I think Ethereum has as good of a chance as Solana, as Bitcoin, etc. I mean, the incentives are very strong for those communities, whether it's Ethereum researchers who have already kind of identified this issue. I think the Solana community hasn't really surfaced it nearly enough, and Bitcoin now is finally starting to kind of, to some extent, surface it, although, again, not nearly enough. And so for me, this year is all about like sending the alarm and probably being called a grifter or whatever, and that's fine. But, there has to be concerted, significant, proactive efforts on the part of these communities to take steps that, will also result in some hard decisions and difficult trade-offs, including potentially breaking social contracts to a large extent. And so as a user, as a blockchain, community member, I'm going to be evaluating my community, my researchers, and I'm going to like hold them accountable. I mean, that's something that, for example, with Telos, we've been developing a lot of ZK snark based. And so we're now doing a lot of research on like the assumptions that go into those snarks in order to like harden the system and ultimately basically take this stuff seriously now and start doing the research now. I think that's the critical phase that we're in at this time. Some believe that if you build a type of bridge into a post-quantum system, that like assets will just move over into that system. And maybe to some extent that might be true. However, even in that scenario, you still introduce risk because there's going to be a bridge, right? And there's going to be like a movement of assets and so on.
Yeah.
And et cetera. Now, what's really important is to not rush like tremendously quickly. So NIST just recently introduced, or rather accepted, a whole bunch of standards, and they just accepted a whole bunch of startups. And so like, this is kind of like the authority in the United States and really globally around this stuff. And so I would carefully monitor what they're doing. I would carefully monitor the latest state of the research. And then, it's kind of like going into 2027, I think we should be ready for like implementation. And if you look at, for example, in the case of Ethereum, it took us like, I don't know, pretty close to a decade to build out this L2 ecosystem.
Yeah.
And our first attempt was to build out like an L1 that would be a world computer with 1,024 shards, which proved to be too hard, too difficult. And then we said, okay, maybe 64 shards. And then it was like one shard. And then it was like, okay, all these like, as some people say, parasitic L2s and so on, right? So even to get to this, kind of L2 stage where the fees are low and Ethereum is scaling has taken a very long time. And I would argue that the complexity around what we need to do just in the case of Ethereum to like make it quantum secure is even more difficult than building the L2 ecosystem. For Solana, it's also very, very difficult, and it could change performance characteristics and so on. For Bitcoin, it's like it's going to face, like I said, the possibility of a broken social contract with like confiscation as potentially on the table of coins and so on, right? So it's all going to get very messy, and there's no clear-cut like way. I mean, there's lots of trade-offs, and like that's why now people have to dig into this and really understand all the different trade-offs so that we can begin to prepare.
Well said.
And that's kind of how I'm looking at it, and so we'll see what happens. I mean,
so you think that was a great explanation, and I'd never really thought about it that way, but it does almost seem relatively binary in the sense of like, for the big dogs, for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solanas, there's really two avenues. You can sort of upgrade the current system, which is the current chain that works right now, and make it PQC compliant, make it quantum safe, or you can sort of fork it / bridge it. Like there's really only two ways, right?
Well, Correct. I mean, right now, that's kind of it, right? You can also create a new chain and launch it and hope to get traction. But, there's another problem that I think the blockchain
It's
ecosystem is going to
tough, yeah.
face, and that's this concept of quantum money or quantum finance, right? So digital assets that are not secured by blockchain infrastructure, but rather secured by the properties of quantum physics. And so with this concept of digital money, you actually could end up in a situation where you have digital assets in your wallet that don't need a ledger. Okay. And the, let's say, underlying physics, particularly around like no cloning theorem, for example, kind of like give you perfect, cryptography and assurances that in fact your digital asset is unclonable and so on, right? So you get these like very strong security guarantees without needing all of this blockchain infrastructure. That's one possibility that I think we're facing in terms of competition, and that's coming down the pipeline very, very soon, in my opinion.
So hold up,
It's going to be
John. Sorry, this is new. Like this is new money. This is like crypto V2 you're talking about here.
correct. Exactly. So you're talking about, so with, blockchains, you have this like trust infrastructure that has economic interests and certain types of cryptography, distributed, wherein on the basis of that, you can kind of like, trade peer to peer without needing to necessarily trust. And so for that reason, we, like cherish this ecosystem, but it comes with a multitude of trade-offs. Those trade-offs are the difference between proof of work, proof of stake, and so on. And then obviously with proof of work, you don't get necessarily the same kind of performance in certain contexts. With proof of stake, you get different types of, let's say, even political views, because people feel like off-taking of energy, for example, and providing ancillary services to the grid
Good point.
vis-a-vis proof of work
Good
is
point.
one of the key crypto use cases, right? And so on. So even within that, we have different factions and different views. But then now you introduce this new concept where, just like how I give you $100 crisp, brand new $100 bill, US $100 bill, you can kind of like inspect the security elements of that bill and have a high degree of confidence that it's real, right? And so you don't need this like online decentralized trust infrastructure to verify that. To some extent, it's a similar analogy where now I send you kind of this digital asset based on this quantum money concept, and leveraging quantum physics, in particular, this no cloning theorem, and the fact that quantum states are like extremely unique. I mean, they're totally unique and can't be reproduced. You can have total assurances that your digital asset is real. And the only other entity who could like verify that would be the issuer. And so you can imagine a scenario where the future Tether is going out there and printing all sorts of quantum money US dollar digital assets. And, you and I as users are trading them and sending them to each other for payments and so on. And, we have very, very strong assurances and guarantees that these are authentic without needing all this blockchain infrastructure behind us. And so I have a view that when you're talking about quantum money in the future, and you're talking about like the money that AI is going to use, I think we have, serious competition coming, right? So for blockchain networks today, it's not just a matter of, well, we have to mitigate and prepare, so that we can, not be attacked by a quantum computer. Well, in addition to that, we also need to compete with the feature sets and improvements and, let's say, desired characteristics of this new type of digital asset that the market is, I think, going to desire. And so, it's a multi-pronged problem here that, like, we need to think about very carefully.
Jeez. You just put my mind in a blender here, John. It's going on full speed. I'm in the blender. I'm in the dryer. My head's just spinning. That is insane. Could you imagine the 15, let's say in 5 years, we'll call it the 15, 20 years of work that the crypto community has worked their asses off for and grifted for and done some terrible things, but more good things for, just becomes nullified by quantum money. Q money just comes in. It's more efficient. It's better. It's unhackable. Wrecks the parade. Jeez Louise. Made my head spin there. This is the first time I've heard about quantum money too, which is quite interesting. So, jeez.
Yeah, it's a topic that's been around for quite some
Yeah.
time in the kind of theoretical physics community and so on. And I think it's going to be a bit of a buzzword that's going to grow over time. But yes, I mean, the reality is that as technology continues to innovate, we will see, just like how Bitcoin, and, Bitcoin is a function of technology, complementary technologies reaching a certain level of maturity, enabling this network to spin up and propagate and grow and so on, right? So you need like all sorts of things that didn't exist before. In addition to hardware, you need, all the networking around making the internet fast, and, hardware manufacturing and supply chains, etc. So you can get the miners and so on and so forth. And so just like with anything, things will improve. And so the notion that the current state that we view right now in terms of what the digital asset landscape looks like is going to be like unchallenged, or isn't going to necessarily change, or that the only thing that's going to change is some marginal, like, for example, how we rehypothecate tokens or whatever. I don't think so. I think fundamentally, digital assets are going to change as technology continues to, evolve. And so it stands to reason that we're going to have really interesting new stuff coming down the pipeline that's both very exciting, but it's also like a competitive pressure to the existing cryptocurrency ecosystem. That's for sure.
Yeah, well said. What are the best ways to get involved right now? Obviously, the low-hanging fruit would be just learn, go on YouTube, play around with ChatGPT or Grok or whatever LLM you use. Obviously, follow John on Twitter as he's tossing out fire articles on quantum. Seems like every couple of days there's a new banger coming out. I love reading those. Are there any projects, and obviously plug your own, but like what excites you about quantum present day that isn't like super future forward looking?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. There's a lot of different ways to get involved. First of all, I think making a bit of a concerted effort to understand, like, as best as you can, what this stuff really is and isn't, and drawing your own conclusions, right, about its viability and so on. And there's lots of resources online, and that's pretty straightforward and easy. In the crypto community, we tend to follow like crypto influencers or whatever, whether it's devs or, KOLs or meme accounts or whatever. But there's great physicists on Twitter as well, or on X, and there are communities, where like these people who basically have nothing to do with blockchains really are posting and sharing incredible information. And so even if you just like stumble upon a white paper and you don't understand it, put it into ChatGPT, ask it to make it simple for you, try reading it based on, the cliff notes and so on, read it a couple times. And then there's great YouTube channels as well, where you can find lots of really interesting information. And so after like a few weeks or so, you start to get a understanding. And then from there, you can like decide what it is that you're interested in. If it's really thinking about this blockchain angle, then Quantum Punks is a great organization. I guess it's a little bit more Ethereum leaning, but nonetheless, it's there. It's a guy named Hunter. I think his Twitter handle is Hunter Beast or something or whatever. Great guy. He's the guy who's talking about all the Bitcoin stuff and put forward that bit proposal. Follow people like Jameson Lopp. And then there's an emerging ecosystem. So, I invested in these guys called Never Local. And so, a few physicists from Oxford who also happen to be, crypto people. They produce a lot of content. They host events. There was an incredible meetup a couple weeks ago in Paris, Quantum Punks event. So another way to think about it is in the early days of Bitcoin, like 2013, 2014, there was BitDev meetups, especially in New York and Berlin and London. And those were like very exciting meetups to attend. It's the same kind of energy right now. Like the Quantum Punks event in Paris a couple weeks ago was like, it's probably like 50, maybe 100 people there. It was like tremendously avant-garde, very exciting. So find those events. There's a conference called Eth Naples or Napoleth in Naples, Italy. Last year, it was phenomenal. The venue was incredible in Italy, beautiful church. It was stunning. This year, and they had Quantum Corner. This year, they're doing it again. And it's going to be like probably half the program is going to be related to this stuff. And so these kinds of events are popping up as well. And I think once you just start kind of digging into it, you'll find these communities. And then, after a few months, you'll definitely have a much more informed opinion. And in my case, and I think in a lot of other people's cases, it's very fascinating once you start thinking about all the possibilities, not just in our narrow kind of Bitcoin blockchain niche, but beyond. It's really, really, if you believe in this like Kardashev scale stuff, right, of like, going from a type 0 to type 1 civilization and so on. If you ever want to live in Dune, okay, where we're like interplanetary and in the future, we're going to need to solve like some really hard problems. And for example,
Yeah.
energy abundance is a hard problem, and the opportunity to simulate something like nuclear fusion and then, kind of like actually build it is very exciting, or molecular biology or other material science and so on, right? So it's not like you can ask a quantum computer anything and it'll give you like this like amazing answer. It's just for a specific set of problems is tremendously effective. And as it turns out, applying some of those problems to much larger problems, particularly engineering challenges, is potentially like this kind of breakthrough that really
Yeah.
may have the potential to advance society as it relates to, building advanced technologies and so on. So it's also from that standpoint intellectually very stimulating, because it's not just like, oh well, let's make better money, or let's kind of
100%.
like, I don't know, it's I think it's time for a lot of people in the blockchain ecosystem to kind of go beyond, because sometimes it's a little kind of like constrained in some of the ways we think, just because there's a limited amount of use cases that our ecosystem can really address, right? So it is intellectually, I would say, a lot more stimulating too, to get kind of into the woods of this stuff.
Yeah, endless possibilities. It has made my head absolutely spin. John, what an episode, man. I had an absolute blast. We barely scratched the surface as well. Got to have you on for round 2 in the quick future. Before you go today, please drop everything you're working on. I know you got a bunch of stuff. You're obviously the CEO of Telos. You have a VC firm that still continues to make moves. You've invested in a bunch of different companies. You're working for a bunch of different companies. Plug everything and anything you got before we let you go here today.
Oh, well, that's very kind. No, I mean, yeah, definitely Telos. We're still at the cutting edge of like ZK research. I think we're going to keep, and that's something we talked about last time we met in Dubai. We're going to keep working in that direction. Never a Local, super great company. These guys are really at the cutting edge of this like quantum stuff, particularly contextual cryptography and some of these key topics that we discussed today. And yeah, just check me out, johnlilic.info, or find me on Twitter. And thanks for having me on. It's super cool. Always great to talk to you. So thank you.
Folks, what an episode with John Lilic, a huge primer on everything quantum related and how it influences crypto. We talked a little bit about the origin story and evolution of John taking the Q pill, deep dive into the quantum pill, quantum versus blockchain tech, post-quantum money vision, some institutional blind spots, real world signals. And my favorite of all was, again, the concepts for quantum native financial infrastructure. That absolutely blew my mind. Huge shout out to John and the team for making this happen. If you guys enjoyed this one, please do subscribe. It would mean the world to my team and I. Speaking of the team, love you guys. Thank you for everything. And back to the listeners. Folks, it's getting hot outside. It's getting sunny. Go touch some grass, keep on growing those bags, and keep on staying healthy, wealthy, and happy. Love you guys, and we'll see you on the next one. Ciao.